Hi, my name is Dominic-Madori Davis, and I'm a reporter at Business Insider. I'm here with my lovely panelists today, Veronica, Chou, Laith, Murad, Rohan, Kapoor, Gary Wassner, and Brian Rainey. Today, we're going to be discussing fashion startups and ways to help them become more sustainable. But before we dive in, I'm going to give the panelists a few more moments to introduce themselves. Veronica, would you like to go first?
Hi, everyone. My name is Veronica. I'm the founder of Everybody and Everyone, which is an eco-innovative, size-inclusive women's wear brand. And we do clothing that are all sustainable, ranging from US size 00 all the way to US size 24. I'm also on the side an investor in fashion and tech, which are all mainly with a focus in sustainability and innovation.
Brian, maybe?
Fantastic, thanks. Brian Rainey, I'm the CEO of Gooten. Gooten operates a smart supply chain for brands and retailers looking to reshape their e-commerce businesses. Our technology platform provides an unparalleled experience for enterprises interested in leveraging on-demand manufacturing and mass customization as part of their business model.
And Laith?
Hey, my name's Laith Murad. Thank you for having me on here. I am heading up the marketing for a company called Fanvestor, which is really innovative in democratizing investing and bringing capital to talent brands and their fans and allowing them to connect with one another.
And Rohan?
Thanks. Yeah, I manage investor relationships at Gorgias. So I work with consumer-focused VCs and private equity firms. Gorgias itself is a help desk for e-commerce companies that sit on Shopify, Magento, and BigCommerce. And we work with about 5,300 companies at this point.
And last but not least, Gary.
Gary Wassner. I'm the CEO of Hilldun Corporation and the chairman of Interlux Holdings. We finance, factor, advise, work with 450, 500 brands, and I invest through Interlux in various fashion brands.
And so now we will begin. Okay, so Veronica, you run a fashion startup company. How do we make it easier for startups to become more sustainable? Isn't it kind of expensive to use sustainable materials?
Yeah, so it's actually not always the easiest, but for our brand, for example, we really are eco down to our buttons, but also our packaging, our hang tags, our labels, of course, our materials. And we also consider where our raw materials are, where we make our fabric, where we make our final garment. And we have to make all those considerations. On average, I'd say at the minimum, 10% more expensive for something that is sustainable, sometimes up to 20, even 30%. And like me, if you want to use innovation, sometimes people expect you to pay R&D as well, R&D investments as well. And it can get really expensive, but I think it's important to me to make sure that every step of the way is sustainable. But I also think that now it's also important for the customers to see that things are sustainable. So therefore, it's something that we have to do. And if there's a will, there's a way. I think 6 years ago, when I wanted to first start a brand, there was maybe one brand out there that had recycled plastic bottles for their leggings. And now I think it's much more easily accessible. There's a lot more people doing it. And the more we ask for it as small brands, as big brands, as medium-sized brands, as consumers, the more suppliers would have to innovate and the more suppliers would have to provide such options. So I think we're definitely moving towards the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, like, and kind of on like the cost, it seems that even though there is kind of like a little bit of a higher cost associated with it, it seems that startup companies and the new companies that we have now are kind of have an advantage over some legacy and heritage brands when it comes to sustainability. What are the startups and new businesses doing now that these legacy and heritage brands just aren't doing?
Yeah, I think startup brands, sometimes it's easier to say no to suppliers which are not sustainable enough. And for brands that have long-term relationships, they need to go back and negotiate with them or help them make change. And sometimes steering a big ship, as we call it, is a little bit more difficult. So that's definitely the challenge. But I think there's more and more people trying to make these changes these days.
And this is kind of a question for everyone. Does everybody think that it's as challenging as ever to start a business now, or is it easier than it's ever been before?
And let me speak to that if everybody doesn't mind. Since I've financed so many startup businesses and so many mid-level and all different stages, in many respects, it's easier today. There are different challenges, put it that way. But in terms of everybody competing for a digital space, it's pretty much a blank slate. I mean, you can go out there on Instagram and you look the same as any other brand out there. So if you put together a reasonable and realistic statement about who you are and what your brand values are, and you film it well and shoot it well, you have as good a chance of gaining market share as anybody else today. So in many respects, it's an easier environment since everybody's digital today. Very little very little brick and mortar. And we see that in the growth of direct to consumer sales across the board for everybody, regardless of size.
Yeah, to Veronica's point, the legacy brands have a real problem with embedded relationships and long-term contracts that are much more difficult to change over time, where you have a very real ability as a startup to kind of take those best practices and, to Veronica's point, really establish what do you want your brand to be about from a sustainability point. I think her point around thinking down to the buttons, Veronica, I really like that quote. You really have to think about it not just in how what the fabric or what the makeup of the underlying item is. You have to think about its life cycle. Who's producing it, right, is as important from a sustainability standpoint as what's being produced and how long it takes to get to the end consumer and how much you're producing, right? If you make a 100% sustainable item and ship it halfway around the world and it sits in a warehouse and never gets sold and ends up in a landfill, you're really not sustainable in an industry right now that is struggling to define what sustainability means, which is where that concept of greenwashing is really used as a cudgel against the industry, in an industry that I believe is truly making strides or attempting to make strides at improving its image from a sustainability standpoint.
You made some really good points, Brian. I think the challenge for brands today is to get the consumer to buy into this, for it to really matter to the consumer. And that's also separate from what a brand can do on its own. I'm working with a group of major retailers now and trying to eliminate plastic hangers and poly bags. Now everything is shipped in a poly bag with a plastic hanger, switched off the plastic hanger onto something else for them to put out on the selling floor. Where do you think those plastic hangers go? Into the trash. And it's terrible because it's plastic. So we can do things internally as well as a brand direct to your consumer. But the challenge still is getting the consumer to buy into the value of a sustainable product. They don't get it in many cases. They just don't get it. But I think after this pandemic, they're going to start to understand how victimized we can be by things out of our control.
If I can add, I think there's another thing that's happening in the industry, which is, the whole idea of access to capital is more accessible than ever before, right? Crowdfunding with the Jobs Act that went into effect under the Obama administration, went into effect in 2016, allows people, to Gary's point, if you've got an amazing, wonderful story to tell, great photos, you can go onto Instagram, you get a big fan base, you actually can build, through your own fan base, you can get access to capital unlike you have ever before. And those fans become your biggest advocates. They are your champions. So it's not only your best chance to stay true to who you are as a brand, because, they love you for who you are and what you want to be and the sustainability and the innovation that you're producing, but then they're telling all their friends because they are actually become invested in it. And so it's your best marketing channel. And I think that's really critical as you think through, launching your brand, changing your brand, the sustainable story, tell it well, tell it often, and make sure you get your fans to really become, have a vested interest in your brand, and then you'll grow.
I think as important to that, also underlying manufacturing capabilities and techniques have significantly changed so that you don't have to have long-term 25-year relationships into a very long supply chain to be able to launch something with a minimum order of 50,000 or 100,000 pieces. The underlying consumer market itself and the attention span is fractured as well. So short run, high quality, not fast fashion by any means, but really right sizing that ability to test a product out and to Laith's point, get that, establish that connection with your audience. Manufacturing capabilities, logistics capabilities, and the distribution kind of changes that we've seen have all sort of advanced to be able to allow individual designers to find their audience and have the supply chain capabilities to be able to deliver against that opportunity.
Yeah. And to that point, we're working, at Fanvestor, we're working with a group out of Israel called Creator, who is really doing beauty products, sustainable products, for celebrities, wellness, home health, wellness products, and they're doing it production on demand. And, so your demand isn't, hey, I'm going to sell 1,000 units. It is, how big are your fans, and are they really fans? Are they truly going to buy into what your story is? And if they do, your supply chain, to Brian's point, is critical, and the technology allows you to actually move and pivot very quickly.
I think one of the challenges we have today is, and maybe somebody here can address it, maybe you, Veronica, how do we get logistics to align with retail? There's a step removed, the brand's in between. So if the brand isn't telling the logistics, warehousing, shipping, and packaging what to do and how to do it, they're going to do it according to the manual, and it's not going to get to the retailer any differently for one brand over another. So the retailers dictate how they want to receive merchandise, and that's, again, back to the polybags and all of this waste, this horrible waste. And yet they dictate it to the brand, and the brand then tells third party. So as a logistics company, how do we coordinate? How do we get them directly and aligned with sustainability at retail?
Gary, you hit on a major point. We sit in that. That's exactly where we sit. We sit between brands and production partners in that delivery. And those retail needs have not changed, right? I need to have everything polybagged individually. I need to have all of these items. What we're coming up with is sustainable, flexible solutions that meets the underlying requirements, while also effectively saying, look, you can put plastic in, but we're going to start charging a differentiated price for something that is one-time use. If we create an opportunity where there is a substantially similar delivery method by which you can ingest these items, get them on the shelves, right, distribute them, get them into your inventory system, but we do it in a more sustainable way, are you willing to accept effectively the substantially similar method here? But to your point, Gary, it absolutely must be driven by the brand. As Veronica brought up, the brand has to be the one that owns not just that makeup of the underlying item. They have to really own that entire piece and dictate that through the supply chain. And the best way to do that is to connect with the audience, is to say, my consumers demand this, and we can't kind of deviate in one step because it's so much more difficult, or because that's the way that we can sort of quickly get a piece of the sustainability out while ignoring other parts.
And
unfortunately, the cost of this goes to the brand, not the retailer. So you may impose surcharges.
I tackle it also from the selling side. Of course, from the manufacturing side, making product side, we tackle it in terms of sustainability. But I'm an advisor to a company that has 3D fit technology, because returns is a big problem, where consumers would buy something. It might go on the website in September. They don't buy it till November. It takes another 2 months, a month and a half before it gets returned, and then it doesn't really get back, and that actually becomes waste. So there's 3D avatar companies where you can see what size fits you better, instead of consumers buying 2 or 3 items, buying it and then returning it. And the company I'm an advisor to is called Perfectly, and they're launching with one of the big retailers in America. And I think some technologies like that would help in terms of reducing waste and reducing shipping.
And we already have questions. Sorry, we already have questions coming in from the audience. So I'm gonna there's one in for Brian. Why do you feel the fashion industry hasn't yet adopted the model of manufacturing pieces on demand?
Legacy. I mean, it's the same reason that we talked about around inertia, if you will, right? There's long-term legacy relationships that are absolutely there. There's a large gap that you could see today with existing technology of moving towards a more sustainable, more direct kind of opportunity that just needs to get pushed through. We're seeing that adoption curve, especially from about April of last year when supply chains really got tested. You're starting to see people really move towards that. It really is a knowledge-based thing. Is how is the industry pushing this forward? How are we letting brands know this is a complementary service or this is a complementary manufacturing opportunity that can also sustainably extend your supply chain capabilities and extend the amount that you can connect with your customers? So it's one of education in a lot of ways, but I think also just the rate and pace of change of the underlying capability has been so fast over the past 5 to 10 years that it really does take almost a full-time partner within the industry to be bringing best-in-class services and best-in-class hardware and best-in-class operating procedures to be able to get there. I'd be really interested to hear. Veronica is running the actual brand itself. I'm sure that concept, that sort of on-demand concept or small batch concept has been there. How did you weigh that decision versus obviously the economies of scale that can come in when you're producing 10,000, 50,000 pieces of an individual item?
Yeah, it's really, the economies of scale versus like smaller units. But there's a lot of technologies out there that are making made to order, made on demand much easier. And, tech is going to change that.
And just to jump on the investor side of things, because, Veronica, you're an investor and also Rohan works with investors. What does moving away from fast fashion mean from an investor standpoint?
That's a tough question to answer. Moving away from it, all changes are difficult for investors, put it that way. Because you have to look at the cost of it and what's it going to do to the bottom line, which is what an investor is ultimately concerned about. Top line growth, bottom line. So it's a big unknown. It depends how much it's going to cost the brand. And if it is going to pay itself back, we know it's going to pay itself back by virtue of sustainability. But again, get the consumer to buy into that so your top line grows parallel with the expense growth. So it's a challenge. You have to look at each brand and how they manage their supply chain and how they manage their expenses and what their priorities are, what their margin is. All of it matters to an investor.
And this was an audience question for Veronica. What do you look at when deciding the type of startups you want to invest in?
For me, I really clear. If it's not sustainability, that's where I draw the line. I don't even look at it. So that's the first thing. But after that, it's really, I think a big part is the team. Of course, there needs to be a business plan. How big is the market? How good is the product market fit? There's so many aspects to look into. And these days, marketing is so important. Some people are scientists and they come up with something and they don't know how to run a business. So unfortunately, that might be a bit tough. So it's there's lots of different aspects. But also back to your first question, I think investors across the board, from the big guys like BlackRock or the people who are buying stocks and big banks, everyone are talking about more ESG focused, sustainably focused investing, and then definitely purpose driven. And so that's definitely where all the money is heading towards in the near future.
I would definitely agree with that point. Obviously in my role at Gorgias, exclusively I'm responsible for taking companies in our portfolio. We have about 5,300 at this point. And within that, we have a ton of fashion and apparel companies that are looking to raise capital. So sometimes, to be quite transparent, it's interesting, Veronica, you say that about the sustainability line, because sometimes I'll pitch fashion and apparel companies and investors might not want to look at it just because of the competitive nature of the space. But I think increasingly they're looking more towards sustainability and are these brands ethical? Do they have some sort of philanthropic component to them? And I think the pandemic has had a big effect on that because brands have increasingly moved online. during the course of the pandemic and looked at how they can make things more sustainable throughout the course of their business operations. And investors that typically wouldn't have looked at those fashion and apparel brands before, I think are now. And I think they will into the foreseeable future due to what's happened over the last 11, 12 months.
Rohan, when push comes to shove though, right, returns matter, right? And so Gary's point of it costs money to be sustainable and there's margin, compression there, while at the same time, even with the democratization of the underlying sales channel and going much more direct to consumer, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Google is taking a larger and larger and larger share of that kind of transaction kind of wallet. How do you balance if it comes to environmental sustainability and margin and kind of that ability to get out? How do you spend one more incremental dollar on acquiring revenue versus being sustainable? How do you see that marriage? You can absolutely get the door open, right? Veronica will not talk to you if you are not sustainable, but then how do you balance that with the need to really show returns?
Yeah, sorry. It's I think I froze for a second there. It's a very good question. It's all about finding that balance of what's going to make sense for the consumer, especially from a price standpoint. So what is important to the consumer when you're developing new sustainable fashion as opposed to fast fashion, right? So, a company that I used to work with, Pasco, given what's happened throughout the course of the pandemic and, struggling workers and communities, economically struggling to survive and from a health perspective as well, what they did is they took a lot of their manufacturing, they moved it from Asia into the US. And what they did is they employed and empowered, displaced garment workers to embrace the consumer's desire for sustainability, because that's who their core demographic is. So I think, to your point, it ties into how do you research the customer? How well do you know your customer for that matter? And are they willing to pay for what you're doing based on how sustainable you are in that process?
Yeah, and just to talk a little bit about the consumer, this is a question I kind of have for everybody. So what happens if, the consumer just doesn't want to pay for things that are more sustainable or eco-friendly? Like, even if, we make sure, or because as we were all talking about it does cost money to even make sure that, the workers in the factories are getting paid, fairly. What if consumers just don't care? Like, what if they still want fast fashion? Do we have to, find technology to make fast fashion more sustainable or lessen its impact? What do we do there? Because it looks like probably going to have to be coexisting in some ways.
Yeah, we have to do a few different things, frankly. We have to make the consumer understand how vital this is. That's bigger than us. That's a bigger concept than us. But at the same time, we have to bring the costs down to making this a profitable venture as well. Scale, it's going to be doing it more, doing it better. People have to learn how to handle these things, and unfortunately, we don't yet know how to do that. It's going to take time. It's a whole change for an industry. We went through this with organic product. How many of you remember the phase that we went through? And I hate to say it was a phase, but it was, where everybody was trying to sell organic to the consumer. Consumer just didn't get it at all. And the costs were higher for organic cotton and so on. And the consumer just didn't get it. And it was about a year and a half, 2 years of attempting to convince the consumer that organic product was better and more sustainable. And it just didn't work. So we moved on. And we don't want to see that happen here, because this is too critical to all of us. So it's education.
Yeah, I think through COVID, go ahead.
I was just going to add on to that. I think, that goes back to the storytelling. And, as a kind of student of history across industries, I think you can also look at electric cars, right? The Prius, half the people, when it came out, it was cool. It had a cool factor. Celebrities were driving it, but nobody really liked the design. It wasn't until Tesla broke the model, made a sexy car, fun, and then decided to put it inside shopping malls so that the consumers could see it, as opposed to getting to a dealership. And I think fashion is going through the same kind of transition as you see, look, I love the brand Allbirds. I love Tom's, but I like the brands, but I don't like the design. So when it becomes and it starts to marry with the two and things Veronica is doing, where you're looking at the details, the buttons and everything else, and the story gets told and the product is the brand, I think people will embrace that premium. But if you don't tell it well and you don't have a product that fits the market with what the market demands, just because it's sustainable will never finish the story. You need it all to come together, from the supply chain to the fabrics to the design. You need to make it the sexiest product out there, as opposed to, it's nice, but it's sustainable.
Yeah. And I think through COVID, I've definitely seen that consumers are more aware and more wanting to buy sustainable products. But also as a consumer myself, as a regular person, I think it's also just send an email to a brand and say, hey, is there sustainable options? I get all these questions all the time through my brand, but let's go ask the big brands, the multi-billion-dollar brands that have been there for a long time. Let's go talk to governments and let's push our government to do more and make change more in policy. It can be as simple as one email that makes a whole chain of action that happens. And some of the bigger companies that has been around for a long time, they're the ones who have the money that can be put into research and development. And then hopefully they would then share it with more people. So all the cost comes down in the future.
Gary brought up a point also about that idea of the agency problem, right? So Gary, your point around shipping an item in a more sustainable way, that cost right now is borne by the brand. It's not borne by the retailer. Right. And so how do we also start to fix that idea of who is actually paying for and absorbing that cost of increasing the underlying sustainability? And to that end, how are you truly costing something that is single use versus something that can be recycled or upcycled or reused? How can you truly show that something that is reusable has a longer life, where the person who's paying for it is the one who's also either feeling the pain of that one-time use cost or accreting the benefit of being able to reuse that? I think that's another very, very difficult problem that, to Laith's point around Tesla partially broke the distribution model. They cut out the dealer, which meant that they could pour all of the money they would otherwise share from a distribution channel dislocation back into research and development, back into design, back into increasing the sort of quality of their underlying item.
Yeah, and I guess kind of taking all of this into consideration, so how do startups really manage all of these complex business structures, these ideas, consumer expectations, to and protecting themselves to become a unicorn company?
Well, for young brands, it's easier. For startups, it's actually easier. You begin the process thinking about sustainability. So your costing initially includes the cost of being sustainable. It may make you less competitive, but you start off with that message as well. So it's easier than converting from a margin all of a sudden being eroded by virtue of trying to become sustainable. So in many cases, it's easier for a startup to do it from the beginning. And I see more and more doing it. Sustainability is part of their ethic right away. And I think that's a great thing to see.
Veronica also made the point of the concept of economies of scale as research and development find more economical ways to upcycle recycled plastics and to provide that, right? And it's the same idea. I don't want to keep going back to the Tesla example, but the underlying broader supply chain of infrastructure has to start to be there, because at the beginning it is going to be more expensive. It's going to be more expensive to utilize recycled polyesters back into the ecosystem, because there's just not as many processing centers. So There's also that idea of how do you start to band together? How do you create the economies of scale where hundreds of direct consumer brands now have one or two primary places that they can go to economically get sustainable products? And I think that's another problem the industry faces itself, is there's really no definition on sustainability, right? You have what is truly sustainable, because there's a wild difference between organic cotton and recycled plastic, upcycled plastic and recycled polyester, right? Some will ultimately biodegrade, some will never biodegrade. So regardless of how many times they're used, where is that? And I think that's another kind of issue, is there's not a real consumer knowledge right now around what does that truly mean beyond kind of broad, terms like recycling and fair trade and a few other items?
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump to some audience questions because we actually have a lot coming in. Here's one. With keeping production low to avoid excess production, the costs are so high, especially when producing in New York City. How can a company keep things small and sustainable but still make a profit?
That's a very difficult question to answer. Everybody's been trying to do this for a long time. Those who manufacture still in New York or in LA, they see the costs of manufacturing, the labor costs and so on. It's very hard to just produce even if you're not sustainable and be competitive. So I don't think there's a quick and easy answer to that question. But there are a lot of efficiencies you can bring to your cutting room. I mean, zero waste product is just one thing to apply to the way you design and cut. Don't leave 30% on the cutting room floor, when you're cutting fabric. So be more intelligent, and you can be more efficient and cost effective. And you can do that as a small company.
To that point, though, also, we really need to think about, New York is the greater New York region, right? And if you think about the broad country in 8 shipping zones, right? Can you have a 1 or 2 zone production capability that gets to New York in 1 or 2 days? I mean, this is about educating the consumer. Are you willing to wait 1 extra day from getting that item, tomorrow versus in 2 days? If so, I can open a technologically advanced factory in an economic opportunity zone, which brings jobs and has the ability to service the New York or LA market on a 2-day standard shipping, rate. Now, that is a redesign of a supply chain that 30 years ago moved from those centers, internationally. And so bringing that back online, and again, supplementing that, these are not either ors in a lot of cases. This is how you create a multi-channel sustainable supply chain that also meets that concept of underlying sustainability when you think about production, when you think about shipping and logistics, when you think about the entire carbon footprint of an item from the sort of mill for the underlying cloth all the way through the cutting floor to ultimately the delivery to the end consumer.
I'm an investor in a factory that we just opened in May in St. Louis, and it's a high-tech knitting factory, one of the first new knitting factories in this country. St. Louis used to be the second largest apparel manufacturing city in the country a long time ago. And it has 0 manufacturing basically now until we reopen this. It's called Evolution St. Louis. And it's high-tech knitting. It's as competitive as anything done overseas now. And yet your supply chain is so much clearer. You know where it's being made, how it's being made, what's being used. Your time to get it to market is cut so significantly by virtue of it being domestic and right in the center of the country. So yes, as you were saying, Brian, there are multiple opportunities today in regional areas to rebuild manufacturing and make it more cost effective to produce here. And for startups too, because you don't have these huge minimums that you have overseas. And you can be much more in control of your supply chain. So it's certainly possible. We proved it here.
And my last question, or I think we have time for one more. I'm going to throw it to Laith real quick, because since we spoke a lot about the consumer and educating them, someone wants to know, do you feel the crowdfunding investing will be something that grows as we progress toward the future of the industry to have the consumer feel more connected?
Definitely. Look, they just upped for regular crowdfunding, Reg CF, they upped it from up to $1 million to $5 million. So they see that the importance of allowing fans to, your fans, your advocates to invest is critical. It also allows a brand to stay true to who they are, where, private equity, we heard from Gary, investors are looking for top line, bottom line, revenue, profits. You can focus on revenue, you can focus on adoption, you can focus on scaling and acceleration, with a little bit less of a concern on some of the underlying true principles of investing that a VCP firm would expect from you. And then when you get that momentum and you need to take it to the next level, they'll rate, as individuals who are major investors will rate you on, okay, how's your revenue growth? Are you 50%? Are you 150%, 250%? Oh my gosh, the adoption is great. Now let's bring you the economies, the scale that you're allowed to do, and leverage all of our relationships, supply chain to distribution to everything. You don't have to rely on Instagram, who's taking a piece, even though you built your fan base. You've actually, they let you distribute to 5% of their fans, and then they tell you to pay for the rest of the 95%, even though you built them. So having that direct relationship is really critical, and then it will help you future as you go to scale to the next level. And, people like Brian, Gary will, at that point come in and really take you to the next level.